So here's three defenses I would stash heading into week 11, into 12. The first one's the Green Bay Packers. This week the Packers, I like their matchup pretty decent as well. But the Packers, they got dropped in 35% of fantasy leagues heading into the week. This week they got a matchup with the Indianapolis Colts, which it isn't the greatest of matchups. They're middle of the pack in fantasy points given up, but this is more of a stash for week 12 when they versus the Chicago Bears on Sunday Night Football. So Green Bay, they're available in a bunch of leagues, like I said. 63% of leagues. This stash is more for next week, but you could also use them this week as well if you need a defense. But it's definitely a week 12 stash because they got Chicago and then Philly coming up. Two teams that give up a lot of fantasy points to defenses. Chicago gives up the 5th most and Philly 4th. So Green Bay Packers, if you got a bench spot, go out there and stash them. The next defense is the New York Giants. They're on bye week this week, so they got dropped in a bunch of leagues after that game with Philly. They're only owned in 12% of fantasy leagues is the Giants. And the last few weeks, their defense and team have played pretty well. And now in week 12, they got Cincinnati, who gives up the 9th most fantasy points to defenses. So the Giants, they're not a bad ad. They've scored double-digit fantasy points in 3 out of their last 5 fantasy games. So that's pretty solid. Their worst week since then has been 4 points. Last week versus Philly, they had 8 fantasy points. So the New York Giants defense, they're not a bad get. They're available in almost 90% of leagues. So their team, you could easily stash at the position on defense. And the third and final defense is the Washington football team that I would look to stash. A lot of teams dropped Washington after the bad performance last week. But this week, you could even use them as well versus Cincinnati. But the real game is for Thursday's game on Thanksgiving versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys are giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to defenses this year. And in week 7, 19 fantasy points. This same Washington football team had versus Dallas, only allowing 3 points the whole game with 6 sacks and into and a safety. And now, week 11 versus Cincy, you could use them this week. But I think this is more of a week 12 stash versus that week Dallas Cowboy team on Thanksgiving Day. So that's 3 defenses I would stash heading into week 11 and 12.